Carl Jung believed that the wound is the place where the light enters you. For the empath, this truth is both devastating and liberating. Because their wounds aren't minor scrapes. They're deep lacerations carved by people they trusted, loved, and defended long after those people stopped deserving any of those things. The empath begins their journey as the wounded healer, pouring into others from a cup that's already empty. They give and give and give, believing that their capacity for love is infinite, that their empathy is a superpower, that their sensitivity makes them special. And it does make them special, but not in the way they think. It makes them visible to predators who can smell an open heart from miles away. The narcissist finds them like a heat-seeking missile. They recognize the empath's wound before the empath does. That childhood need for validation. That desperate desire to be seen. That belief that if they just love hard enough, broken people will become whole. The narcissist doesn't heal this wound, they weaponize it. For months, maybe years, the empath bleeds while trying to bandage someone else. They contort themselves into impossible shapes trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for them. They translate cruelty into misunderstanding, abuse into rough patches, manipulation into love. They become smaller and smaller, dimmer and dimmer, until they barely recognize themselves in the mirror. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The empath's consciousness arrives not in a moment of clarity, but in a moment of breaking. Something inside them finally shatters, not from one big blow, but from the accumulation of 1,000 small cuts, each one tolerated, each one explained away, each one absorbed into their body like poison. This breaking is the death that precedes rebirth. The old empath, the one who believed everyone deserves endless chances, who thought that love could save anyone, who mistook self-sacrifice for virtue, that person dies. And for a while, there's only grief and emptiness where they used to be. But Jung understood that in the darkness, something alchemical happens. The shadow, all those repressed parts of yourself you've been taught to deny, begins to emerge. The anger you swallowed. The boundaries you never set. The selfishness you were told was evil. The capacity to say no without guilt. The ability to walk away without looking back. The wounded empath starts to feel these shadow elements rising and it terrifies them. Because they've built their entire identity on being good, kind, understanding, patient. They've worn their empathy like armor against a world that told them feeling deeply was weakness. But the shadow doesn't care about your identity. It demands integration. This is where the warrior begins to take form. Not the warrior who fights others, but the warrior who fights for themselves. The warrior who understands that protecting your peace isn't cruelty, it's survival. The warrior who recognizes that some battles aren't worth fighting because some people aren't fighting for connection, they're fighting for control. Jung said that the shadow is 90% gold. The empath discovers this truth as they stop rejecting their darkness and start examining it. Their anger isn't toxic, it's information about violated boundaries. Their selfishness isn't evil, it's self-preservation finally asserting itself. Their coldness isn't cruelty, it's discernment that saves them from repeating the same patterns with different people. The transformation from wounded to warrior isn't smooth or pretty. The empath stumbles through it, making mistakes, overcorrecting, swinging from doormat to fortress and back again. They lose people in the process, not just the narcissist, but the whole ecosystem that benefited from their woundedness. The friends who only called during crises. The family members who demanded endless emotional labor. The partners who mistook their empathy for weakness. This loss feels like failure at first. The empath wonders if they're becoming the very thing they despised, cold, selfish, unavailable. But Jung would tell them this is necessary. You cannot become whole by remaining fragmented. You cannot heal by continuing to wound yourself for others' comfort. The warrior empath learns to sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it. They learn that silence is sometimes the most powerful response. They discover that walking away doesn't require explanation or justification. They understand that closure is something you give yourself, not something you extract from people who are never capable of honest reflection. This process strips away everything false until only truth remains. And the truth is this: the empath was never weak. Their empathy was never the problem. What was broken wasn't their capacity to feel, it was their inability to discern who deserved access to those feelings. Jung taught that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The wounded empath was becoming who others needed them to be. The warrior empath becomes who they actually are, someone who can feel deeply without drowning in others' emotions, someone who can love fiercely without losing themselves, someone who can offer compassion without accepting disrespect. The shadow work continues. Each day brings new discoveries about old patterns. Each trigger reveals another layer of conditioning to shed. Each boundary enforced strengthens the warrior's resolve. The empath realizes they're not healing in a straight line, they're spiraling upward, revisiting the same lessons at deeper levels until the wisdom fully integrates. And somewhere in this spiral, something shifts. The empath stops seeing their journey as recovery from what the narcissist did and starts seeing it as discovery of who they've always been beneath the wounds. The warrior was always there, waiting beneath the layers of people-pleasing and self-betrayal. The narcissist didn't create their weakness, they just exploited wounds that already existed. This realization is both humbling and empowering. It means the empath has work to do that has nothing to do with their abuser. It means their healing belongs to them, not to the narrative of victimhood. It means they have the power to ensure this never happens again, not by changing others, but by changing themselves. Jung knew that the wound is where the light enters, but he also knew that you have to do something with that light once it arrives. The wounded empath let it scatter, offering illumination to everyone but themselves. The warrior empath gathers that light inward, using it to see clearly what they'll accept, what they won't, and who they're becoming in the space between. Jung observed that the acceptance of oneself is the essence of the moral problem, and the acid test of one's whole outlook on life. The warrior empath faces this test daily as they navigate the space between who they were and who they're becoming. The wounded version forgave everything. The warrior version forgives selectively. And learning to live in that tension without collapsing back into old patterns requires a strength the empath didn't know they possessed. The rise begins when the empath stops apologizing for their transformation. People will call them changed, cold, different. They'll say success went to your head or you're not the person I knew. And they're right. The empath isn't that person anymore. That person almost died trying to keep everyone else alive. That person sacrificed themselves on an altar of other people's comfort. That person is gone, and the warrior feels no obligation to resurrect them. Jung taught that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. The warrior empath does this terrifying work. They accept that they ignored red flags because they wanted to believe in someone's potential more than they wanted to protect themselves. They accept that they stayed too long because leaving felt like admitting failure. They accept that their empathy became a liability when they offered it without discernment. This acceptance isn't self-blame, it's self-knowledge. And self-knowledge is power. The empath who understands their own patterns can't be caught in the same trap twice. They recognize love bombing before they're swept away. They spot manipulation before they're entangled. They identify emotional vampires before they're drained dry. The warrior rises by doing what Jung called shadow work, integrating the parts of themselves they've rejected. They befriend their anger instead of suppressing it. They honor their needs instead of apologizing for them. They embrace their capacity for coldness, understanding that what looks like coldness to others is actually clarity to themselves. They become comfortable with being misunderstood because being understood by the wrong people means nothing. This integration creates an internal fortress. Not walls that keep everyone out, but boundaries that let the right people in. The warrior learns that healthy relationships don't require you to defend your boundaries constantly. They're simply respected. That real love doesn't ask you to prove your worth repeatedly. It acknowledges it freely. That genuine connection doesn't leave you depleted, it leaves you energized. Jung wrote that where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, love is lacking. The wounded empath kept trying to love people who only understood power. The warrior empath stops translating between these two languages. They simply step away from conversations conducted in the language of dominance and control. The rise accelerates when the warrior empath reclaims their energy. For years, they've been a battery for everyone else's devices, always charging others, never plugged into their own source. Now they disconnect from people and situations that drain them. They stop being the emotional support system for people who offer no support in return. They withdraw their presence from spaces where their absence goes unnoticed but their utility is always needed. This energy reclamation reveals something shocking. The empath has dreams they'd forgotten, talents they'd buried, desires they'd silenced. The bandwidth they were using to manage other people's emotions becomes available for their own growth. They start creating instead of just caretaking. They start building instead of just fixing. They start living instead of just surviving. Jung believed that the creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect but by the play instinct. The warrior empath rediscovers play. They laugh without calculating whether it will trigger someone. They pursue joy without worrying whether it will provoke jealousy. They take up space without apologizing for their existence. They become selfish in the holiest sense, devoted to the self they'd abandoned in favor of others. The shadow integration continues as the warrior faces their capacity for cruelty. They discover they can be vicious when protecting their peace. They can be ruthless when enforcing boundaries. They can be merciless when cutting off access to people who've proven themselves untrustworthy. And instead of being horrified by these qualities, they recognize them as necessary tools for self-preservation. This doesn't mean the warrior becomes cruel. It means they become capable of cruelty, and choose not to use it except in defense of their well-being. Jung would say this is true power, not the inability to harm, but the ability to harm paired with the restraint not to. The wounded empath had restraint without ability. The warrior has both. The rise becomes unstoppable when the warrior stops seeking validation from the people who wounded them. They don't need the narcissist to acknowledge the harm. They don't need flying monkeys to see through the lies. They don't need anyone who participated in their diminishment to suddenly champion their growth. They've become their own validator, their own witness, their own proof that they were never the problem. Jung said that I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. The warrior empath chooses to become whole. They take the shattered pieces of who they were and arrange them into a mosaic that's more beautiful than the original form. Every crack becomes a place where light gets through. Every scar becomes a reminder of battles survived. Every wound becomes a source of wisdom they can offer to others still bleeding. The warrior discovers they're no longer interested in revenge. Not because they've become enlightened beyond human emotion, but because revenge requires giving energy to people who've already taken too much. The warrior's energy is precious now, allocated only to people and pursuits that add value to their life. The narcissist doesn't qualify. The toxic people don't qualify. Even the thought of them doesn't qualify. This indifference is the ultimate victory. The wounded empath was controlled through their inability to stop caring. The warrior empath has mastered the art of directed caring, choosing deliberately where their emotional investment goes and withdrawing it just as deliberately when it's not reciprocated or respected. Jung taught that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The narcissist transformed the empath into a warrior. And the warrior, rising from the ashes of who they used to be, transforms everyone they touch, not by trying to fix or save them, but by showing them what's possible when you choose yourself. Jung warned that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The warrior empath has made their darkness conscious. They've examined every uncomfortable truth about themselves, the ways they enabled their own mistreatment, the pattern of choosing unavailable people, the comfort they found in being needed because being wanted felt too vulnerable. This consciousness transforms pain into wisdom. The warrior no longer sees their past relationships as wasted time but as expensive education. Every betrayal taught them something about discernment. Every lie revealed something about their capacity for self-deception. Every moment they stayed when they should have left showed them exactly how much they'd been willing to sacrifice for the illusion of connection. The rise continues as the warrior develops what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it. They can acknowledge that the narcissist hurt them deeply while also accepting that dwelling on that hurt serves no purpose. They can feel compassion for the wounded child inside their abuser, while maintaining absolute boundaries with the adult who refuses to heal. They can honor what the relationship taught them while having zero interest in repeating it. This capacity for paradox makes the warrior unbreakable. Because they're no longer operating in black and white, all or nothing, victim or villain. They exist in the gray space where complexity lives, where people can be both wounded and wounding, where you can understand someone completely and still choose not to have them in your life. Jung believed that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. The warrior has made their inner situation conscious, and so they stop repeating the same fate with different faces. They recognize the pattern before it fully forms. They see the red flags they used to paint green. They hear the love bombing that used to sweep them away, and now just makes them step back. This pattern recognition extends beyond romantic relationships. The warrior identifies emotional manipulation in friendships, family dynamics, work environments. They spot the people who only show up when they need something. They recognize the relationships that require them to shrink, to silence themselves, to manage someone else's fragility at the expense of their own authenticity. And they walk away. Not with drama or explanation, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knows their worth. The warrior has learned that not everything deserves a confrontation. Some things just deserve an exit. Jung taught that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. The warrior empath discovers that becoming who they truly are means disappointing people who were comfortable with the false version. Their authenticity will be called selfishness by people who benefited from their self-betrayal. Their boundaries will be called cruelty by people who enjoyed unlimited access. Their peace will be called coldness by people who thrived on chaos. The warrior hears these accusations and feels nothing. Not because they've become heartless, but because they've finally learned the difference between guilt and manipulation. Real guilt propels you to make amends for actual harm. Manufactured guilt tries to manipulate you back into accepting harm. The rise accelerates as the warrior reclaims their narrative. For so long, they let others define their story, the narcissist who painted them as crazy, oversensitive, the problem. The flying monkeys who believed the lies without question. The people who witnessed the abuse and chose silence. The warrior stops giving these people authorship over their life. They write their own story now. And in that story, they're not the victim who was destroyed. They're the hero who survived, learned, and transformed. They're not broken, they're breaking free. They're not damaged, they're discovering what they're capable of when they're no longer carrying dead weight. Jung observed that the most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm that is not easily disturbed. The warrior has overcome the most intense conflict of their life, the battle between their need to be loved and their need to be free. Freedom won. And the security that emerged from that victory is unshakable. This security manifests in unexpected ways. The warrior stops over-explaining themselves. They say no without providing a dissertation on why. They make decisions that serve them without taking a poll. They trust their intuition even when it contradicts popular opinion. They become their own authority instead of seeking permission from people who don't have their best interests at heart. The warrior discovers that solitude isn't loneliness, it's sanctuary. After years of chaotic relationships and emotional turbulence, silence becomes sacred. They're not hiding from the world, they're creating space to hear their own voice again. That voice was drowned out for so long by everyone else's needs, demands, and expectations. In that silence, the warrior rebuilds. They pursue passions they'd abandoned. They reconnect with parts of themselves that were sacrificed for relationships that weren't worth the cost. They discover that happiness doesn't require another person's validation. It requires alignment with your own values, your own truth, your own vision for what a good life looks like. Jung said that the meeting with oneself belongs to the more unpleasant things that can be avoided so long as we possess living symbolism. The warrior stopped avoiding that meeting. They sat with themselves in brutal honesty, and emerged with self-knowledge that no one can take away. They know their triggers, their patterns, their non-negotiables. They know what they'll accept and what they won't. They know who they are when no one's watching, when no one needs them, when no one's asking them to be anything other than exactly who they are. This self-knowledge creates an internal compass that always points true north. The warrior can't be gaslit because they trust their own perception. They can't be manipulated because they've studied every tactic. They can't be diminished because they've already survived the worst and emerged stronger. The rise beyond the shadow isn't about transcending darkness. It's about integrating it so completely that it becomes a source of power rather than shame. The warrior empath has done this work. They've turned their wounds into wisdom, their pain into purpose, their breaking into breakthrough. And they're just getting started. Jung believed that what you resist persists, but what you accept transforms. The warrior empath has reached the stage where acceptance becomes transformation. They've stopped resisting the truth of what happened to them and started using it as fuel for who they're becoming. Every betrayal is now data. Every manipulation is now education. Every wound is now a weapon in their arsenal of self-protection. This transformation manifests in ways that shock people who knew the old version. The empath who used to apologize for existing now takes up space without permission. The one who absorbed everyone's anger now deflects it with surgical precision. The one who explained themselves endlessly now offers silence as a complete sentence. The shift is so total that former friends barely recognize them. Jung taught that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. The warrior has stopped trying to fit into anyone else's definition of what an empath should be. They're writing their own definition, one that includes boundaries, self-interest, and the radical notion that protecting your peace isn't a moral failing. The warrior discovers something profound. Empathy doesn't require martyrdom. You can feel someone's pain without taking it on as your own. You can understand someone's struggle without becoming responsible for solving it. You can witness someone's self-destruction without jumping in to save them. This distinction, between empathy and enmeshment, is what separates the wounded from the warrior. Jung observed that we cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. The warrior has accepted their role in their own suffering, not to blame themselves, but to empower themselves. They acknowledge they ignored intuition that screamed danger. They recognize they stayed in situations their body was begging them to leave. They admit they chose potential over reality, repeatedly, painfully, devastatingly. But this acknowledgement doesn't crush them, it liberates them. Because if they participated in their own pain, they also have the power to participate in their own healing. The locus of control shifts from external to internal. They're no longer waiting for the narcissist to change, for family to understand, for the world to validate their experience. They become their own healer, their own validator, their own source of everything they once begged others to provide. The rise intensifies as the warrior learns to transmute pain into purpose. They use their story not as a badge of victimhood but as a roadmap for others still lost in the dark. They share their experience not to gain sympathy but to offer solidarity. They become the person they needed when they were still bleeding, not to save others, but to show them how to save themselves. Jung said that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. The warrior refuses to carry anyone else's unlived life anymore. Not their parents' unhealed trauma. Not their partner's emotional dysfunction. Not their friends' perpetual crises. They've set down every burden that wasn't theirs to carry and walked away lighter than they've been in years. This lightness is intoxicating. The warrior moves through the world differently now, not braced for impact, not scanning for threats, not preparing to manage someone else's emotional state. They're present in their own life for the first time. They notice things they never had bandwidth to notice before. Joy, beauty, possibility, their own desires. The warrior embraces what Jung called the reconciliation of opposites. They can be both soft and strong, both compassionate and boundaried, both open and discerning. They no longer see these as contradictions but as the natural complexity of a fully integrated human being. The wounded empath was one-dimensional, always giving, always understanding, always available. The warrior is multidimensional, giving when it's reciprocated, understanding when it's earned, available when it serves them. Jung believed that people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The narcissist is still running from their soul, still projecting their emptiness onto new victims, still performing the same patterns. But the warrior has faced their soul, every shadow, every wound, every uncomfortable truth. And having faced it, they're no longer afraid of it. This fearlessness changes everything. The warrior takes risks the wounded empath never could. They pursue dreams that require them to be visible, vulnerable, authentic. They put themselves in situations where rejection is possible because they've learned that rejection by the wrong people is protection. They stop playing small to make others comfortable because their own expansion matters more than anyone else's comfort. The warrior develops what Jung called a moral attitude toward the unconscious, a willingness to confront internal truths regardless of how uncomfortable they are. They examine their attractions and ask why they're drawn to unavailable people. They investigate their patterns and ask what childhood wound is being recreated. They interrogate their impulses and ask whether they're operating from healing or from habit. This radical self-inquiry creates profound change. The warrior breaks generational patterns. They refuse to pass their trauma to the next generation. They stop accepting the unacceptable because it's familiar. They choose differently, love differently, live differently than everyone who came before them. Jung taught that the creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. The warrior has found their play instinct again. They create art from their pain. They build communities from their isolation. They craft lives of meaning from the rubble of what was destroyed. They're not just surviving, they're architecting something beautiful from the ruins. The rise becomes unstoppable because the warrior stops measuring their progress against other people's timelines. They don't care if society says they should be over it by now. They don't care if the narcissist has moved on to someone new. They don't care if people think they're taking too long to heal. They're on their own timeline, moving at their own pace, honoring their own process. Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The warrior empath has claimed that privilege. They've shed every false layer, every people-pleasing persona, every version of themselves they created to be acceptable to people who didn't deserve access to their truth. What remains is pure, powerful, unbreakable. The warrior stands in their full authenticity, integrated and whole, ready for whatever comes next. Jung wrote that the question is not what you look at, but what you see. The warrior empath has learned to see clearly, not just the truth about others, but the deeper truth about themselves. They see that their empathy was never the weakness the narcissist claimed it was. It was always their greatest strength, just offered to the wrong people at the wrong price. The final stage of the rise is marked not by hardness but by wholeness. The warrior hasn't lost their capacity to feel deeply. They've gained the wisdom to feel selectively. They haven't abandoned their compassion. They've learned to extend it first to themselves. They haven't become the narcissist. They've become the person the narcissist could never touch again. Jung believed that the foundation of all mental illness is the unwillingness to experience legitimate suffering. The warrior has experienced their legitimate suffering fully. They didn't bypass it with spiritual platitudes or numb it with distractions. They walked through the fire of their pain and let it burn away everything that wasn't essential. What emerged is diamond-hard and light-filled simultaneously. This completion of the hero's journey transforms the warrior into something unexpected, a beacon. Not because they're trying to save anyone, but because their mere existence proves transformation is possible. Other empaths still trapped in toxic dynamics see the warrior and think, if they got out, maybe I can too. The warrior doesn't rescue them, they simply show them the door exists. Jung taught that the meeting with the shadow is the apprentice piece in the individual's development, but the meeting with the self is the masterpiece. The warrior has completed their masterpiece. They've integrated every fragmented part: the wounded child who needed validation, the people-pleaser who betrayed themselves for acceptance, the shadow self who holds anger and boundaries and the capacity to say enough. This integration creates an unshakable center. The warrior can be in the presence of toxicity and not absorb it. They can witness manipulation and not engage with it. They can hear lies about themselves and not feel compelled to correct the record. They've found something the narcissist never will: internal peace that doesn't depend on external validation. The warrior discovers that the ultimate revenge isn't making the narcissist suffer, It's becoming so genuinely happy that whether the narcissist suffers becomes irrelevant. The wounded empath wanted the narcissist to understand the pain they caused. The warrior has stopped needing understanding from people incapable of offering it. They've closed the loop themselves, given themselves the apology they'll never receive, and moved forward into a life the narcissist can't even imagine. Jung said that loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. The warrior has found their people, the ones who understand without needing an explanation, who support without needing to be convinced, who celebrate without needing to diminish. These relationships feel nothing like what came before. They're easy where the toxic ones were exhausting. They're reciprocal where the toxic ones were one-sided. They're nourishing where the toxic ones were depleting. In these healthy connections, the warrior blooms in ways they never could in toxic soil. They discover talents they'd buried. They pursue dreams they'd postponed. They become versions of themselves that the narcissist never got to meet, not because those versions didn't exist, but because those versions couldn't survive in an environment designed to keep them small. The warrior realizes that the narcissist didn't know them at all. They knew a performance, a curated version designed to keep the peace. The real empath, the one with edges and opinions and non-negotiables, that person was hidden away for safety. Now that person lives in full daylight, unapologetic and unafraid. Jung observed that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. The warrior has become exactly that. Not who their family needed them to be. Not who the narcissist shaped them into. Not who society expected. But who they actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the trauma, all the attempts to fit into spaces too small for their spirit. This authenticity is the warrior's final form. They speak their truth even when their voice shakes. They honor their needs even when others call it selfish. They protect their peace even when it disappoints people. They choose themselves even when choosing themselves means standing alone. But the warrior rarely stands alone for long. Because authenticity is magnetic. Real people are drawn to real people. The warrior attracts connections based not on what they can provide but on who they are. These relationships don't require performance or pretense. They require only presence. Jung taught that I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. The warrior has chosen to become whole. They've taken every broken piece and assembled them into a mosaic more beautiful than the original form ever was. The cracks are visible, but they're filled with gold, the Japanese art of kintsugi made flesh. The rise is complete when the warrior realizes they're no longer rising at all, they've arrived. Not at some perfect destination where pain doesn't exist, but at a place of self-possession so complete that pain no longer defines them. They've moved from surviving to thriving, from victim to victor, from wounded to warrior to finally, simply, themselves. The empath who started this journey believed their sensitivity was a curse. The warrior who completes it knows that sensitivity is a gift, one that required discernment to protect but never needed to be eliminated. They feel deeply still, but they feel within boundaries that honor their well-being. They care profoundly still, but they care for people who've earned that care through consistent respect. Jung said that the shoe that fits one person pinches another. The warrior has stopped trying to fit into anyone else's shoe. They've crafted their own, custom-made for the journey only they can walk, designed for the life only they can live. Years from now, when the warrior thinks about the narcissist at all, it won't be with anger or longing. It will be with the detached curiosity you feel for a stranger whose path briefly intersected yours. They'll remember the lessons without reliving the pain. They'll acknowledge the growth without romanticizing the struggle. The warrior's unstoppable rise beyond the shadow ends where all heroes' journeys end, at home. Not a geographical place, but the home they've built within themselves, a sanctuary no one can infiltrate, diminish, or destroy. A place of peace earned through battle, of wisdom earned through suffering, of strength earned through breaking and choosing to rebuild. The empath is finally, completely, gloriously free.